Hello, everybody. Perhaps you hear that sound that's going on in the background, that rhythmic sound. Do you hear it? Well, ironically, since we're talking about economic policy, we have the sound of construction going on in the background, that rhythmic sound of an economy just chugging along. So we're just going to have to deal with it. So now I'm going to talk about different ways that monetary policy is actually implemented. So remember, monetary policy is the idea that if you add money to an economy, you can speed it up, and if you take money out, you can slow it down. And monetary policy is generally done by some type of central bank. In the United States, monetary policy is done primarily by the Federal Reserve Bank, also just known as the Fed or the Federal Reserve. And there are a couple of different ways that the Federal Reserve does monetary policy. So a few different ways that it adds money into the system or takes money out of the system. The first one that we're going to talk about deals with this reserve requirement. The sound of construction has ended, so perhaps the economy is slowing down. So the first way that we're going to talk about that the Federal Reserve can add money to the system or take money out is by raising or lowering what is called the reserve requirement. A reserve requirement is the percentage of money, the percentage of cash that commercial banks, like the Bank of America on the corner, it's the percentage of money that commercial banks must keep in a central bank. So I'll break this down for you. The bank out there on the corner has a bunch of people who have savings accounts in those banks. Say it has on its books, as in keeping track of the money that's in the bank, on its books it has $1 million. Well, there isn't always $1 million sitting in the vault of that bank. The bank uses that money that people deposit to make more money. It invests in things, it buys bonds, it loans that money out to people for things like mortgages or to buy a car. So it does things with all of this money that people deposit, and it does those things in order to make money for itself. But each bank is required to keep at least a chunk of that money in a reserve bank somewhere. The reserve requirement is the percentage of money that banks actually have on their books that they need to actually keep in reserve. So, our bank, say, that has $1 million on the books. Say the reserve requirement is 20%. That means that 20% of the money that that bank has on its books, it can't use. It needs to hold on to that money, usually in a central bank somewhere. So if it has $1 million on the books, it can use $800,000 of those $1 million to loan out to other people to invest in things, but it needs to hold on to $200,000. Okay? Now, if a central bank wants to get more money into the system, it can lower that reserve requirement, say to 10%. Now that bank has an extra $100,000 that it can loan out or invest in other things. So if the reserve requirement was lowered from 20% to 10%, that means that that bank needs to hold less money in reserve. it can now use that money. That money now finds its way into the system. So that's one of the ways that cash is released into the system, by lowering the reserve requirement on commercial banks. If the Federal Reserve wants to do contractionary policy, or to bring money out of the system, it can raise the reserve requirement. So if it was 20%, if the reserve requirement was 20%, that bank had to keep $200,000 on reserve. But if the reserve requirement is raised to, say, 30%, now that bank can only loan out $700,000. It needs to now hold on to $300,000. And that takes money out of the system. And that would be contractionary policy. So, in summary, raising the reserve requirement will take money out of the system, and that would be contractionary policy. Lowering the reserve requirement, which would be expansionary policy, releases more money into the system.